The snow fell silently, blanketing the village of Winter Hollow in a pristine white coat. Christmas Eve had come, but the usual joy and laughter were replaced by a somber mood as villagers gathered at the small stone church atop the hill. Inside, candlelight flickered against the stained glass windows, illuminating rows of solemn faces. Max, a young golden retriever known for his boundless energy and loyalty, sat at the back, his golden fur gleaming in the dim light. He was the only spark of life in the otherwise subdued congregation. When the choir ended their hymn, an eerie silence filled the room. It was then that Max barked, a sharp, insistent sound that echoed through the church. Heads turned, startled. The dog, standing on all fours, was focused intently on the closed casket at the front. His barking grew louder, more frantic. "Quiet, Max," whispered Sophie, the young girl who had raised him since he was a pup. She tugged gently at his leash, but the dog resisted, his amber eyes fixed on the casket as if it held some unspoken truth. From the back row, Thomas, the village's retired watchmaker, cleared his throat. "Father Michael," he called out, his voice tinged with curiosity and unease. "Why is the dog so agitated? Does he sense something we don't?" Father Michael, standing near the casket with a Bible in hand, froze. His grip tightened on the holy book as he glanced at Max. The nervous flicker in his eyes betrayed him, though his lips formed a calm reply. "Animals can be peculiar," he said, his tone even. "Perhaps he misses the deceased." But Max's behavior said otherwise. He clawed at the floor, his growls growing low and guttural, as though trying to warn them all of a danger unseen. The tension was palpable. Sophie knelt beside Max, whispering soothing words, but her voice faltered as the dog's distress began to affect her. "Something's wrong," she murmured, looking toward Father Michael. Thomas stood, his cane tapping against the wooden floor. "Open the casket," he demanded, his tone brooking no argument. A murmur spread through the congregation. Father Michael stepped back, visibly shaken. "That is highly irregular," he said. "We must respect the dead." "Open it," Sophie interrupted, her voice trembling. She looked down at Max, whose intensity had not waned. Max wouldn't behave this way without reason. The room seemed to hold its breath. Finally, Father Michael gave a reluctant nod, signaling the pallbearers. They exchanged uneasy glances before stepping forward. The casket's lid creaked as it was lifted. What lay within silenced the room more effectively than any prayer. The deceased, an elderly man named Edgar Willoughby, stared up at them, not with the stillness of death, but with wide, panicked eyes. His mouth was gagged, his hands bound beneath the folds of the funeral shroud. Gasps and screams erupted as Edgar began to thrash, his muffled cries for help sending chills down every spine. Max barked once more, his tail wagging triumphantly. The secret was out, but as the villagers rushed to free Edgar, Father Michael turned pale, his hand trembling as it clutched the Bible. His secret, the one he had kept buried for years, was clawing its way to the surface, just like Edgar. The chaos inside the church mirrored the storm brewing outside, with wind howling against the stained glass windows. Villagers gathered around Edgar Willoughby, their voices a cacophony of questions and panic as they unbound the elderly man from his shroud. Sophie hugged Max tightly, her heart pounding. The golden retriever had been right. Something was terribly wrong in Winter Hollow. "Water! He needs water!" shouted Mary, the town's midwife, as she knelt by Edgar's side. Someone passed a flask, and Mary gently pressed it to his lips. Edgar coughed violently but managed a weak gulp, his wide eyes darting around the room as though searching for a familiar face. Father Michael lingered near the altar, his normally steady hands trembling as he clutched the edge of the lectern. His gaze flickered toward Thomas, who stood apart from the crowd, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. "Father," Thomas called out, his voice cutting through the din, "you owe us an explanation. How does a man end up bound and buried alive in your church? And don't tell me this is an accident." The crowd quieted, turning their attention to the priest. The weight of their stares pressed down on him, and for a moment, he seemed ready to collapse under it. I don't know," Father Michael stammered. "This must be a terrible mistake." Perhaps the Undertaker. Nonsense, Thomas interrupted, his tone sharp. He pointed his cane at the priest. You've been here longer than any of us. If anyone knows what's going on, it's you. Before Father Michael could respond, Edgar's raspy voice broke through. The crypt, he croaked, his words barely audible. The crypt? Sophie asked, stepping forward. She placed a reassuring hand on Edgar's shoulder. What do you mean? Edgar's eyes locked onto hers, his fear palpable. There's something beneath the church. Something buried. Edgar pointed a trembling finger at Father Michael. He knows. The villagers gasped. Father Michael raised his hands defensively. That's enough, he bellowed, his voice quivering. This is madness. Edgar has been through a traumatic experience. He doesn't know what he's saying, but Edgar's words had planted a seed of doubt. Whispers spread like wildfire among the congregation. Some glanced nervously at the floor beneath their feet, as if expecting it to crack open and reveal the horrors below. Thomas stepped forward, his cane tapping ominously on the wooden floor. If there's truth to this, we deserve to know. Open the crypt. Father Michael paled further, his lips moving soundlessly as though in prayer. That's not possible, he said finally. The crypt is sacred ground, sealed for centuries. Then you won't mind if we take a look, Thomas retorted, his voice steely. If you have nothing to hide, prove it. A tense silence followed. Finally, Father Michael sighed, his shoulders sagging. Very well, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I warn you all, some things are better left undisturbed. The crypt lay beneath the church, accessed through a hidden door behind the altar. The villagers watched anxiously as Thomas, with surprising agility for his age, discovered the mechanism and pulled the door open. A rush of cold air greeted them, carrying the scent of damp stone and decay. Sophie hesitated, gripping Max's leash tightly. The dog's ears perked up, and he sniffed the air, his body tense but alert. We're wasting time, Thomas said, lighting a lantern. Let's go. The group descended a narrow staircase, their footsteps echoing against the stone walls. At the bottom, they found themselves in a vast, dimly lit chamber lined with ancient tombs. The air was thick, each breath heavier than the last. Over here, Edgar whispered, pointing to the far corner. His voice was stronger now, but his fear was still evident. The villagers followed his gaze to a peculiar section of the crypt. Unlike the other tombs, which were marked with names and dates, this one was unadorned. A plain stone slab with no inscriptions. Max growled low, his body rigid as he faced the slab. What is this? Sophie asked, her voice quivering. Father Michael stepped forward reluctantly. It's an old legend, he admitted. This tomb was sealed centuries ago, long before this church was built. The elders said it housed a man accused of unspeakable crimes, a man who vowed to return if disturbed. Thomas snorted. Legends or not, we're opening it. No, Father Michael shouted, his voice echoing through the crypt. You don't understand. If you break that seal, you could unleash something far worse than anything you can imagine. His warning fell on deaf ears. Driven by curiosity and fear, Thomas motioned for two younger men to help him. Together, they began prying the slab loose. The moment the seal broke, a chilling wind surged through the crypt, extinguishing the lantern's flame. Max barked furiously, his howls echoing into the darkness. Sophie clung to him, her heart pounding as the ground beneath them seemed to rumble. From the tomb emerged not a skeleton, but a shadow, a formless, writhing mass of darkness that seemed to pulse with malice. The villagers screamed, stumbling backward as the entity began to take shape. And then it spoke, its voice a deep, guttural growl that reverberated through the crypt. You should not have woken me. The crypt was plunged into chaos as the shadow expanded, its tendrils snaking through the air like living smoke. Max growled fiercely, placing himself between Sophie and the writhing darkness. The villagers scrambled back, their faces masks of terror, while Father Michael fell to his knees, clutching his rosary. The shadow loomed, its form vaguely humanoid yet shifting constantly, as though it couldn't fully solidify. Its voice rumbled again, filling the chamber with a sound that was both ancient and chillingly alive. Centuries, and still, you mortals disturb what should remain forgotten. Sophie pulled Max close, her breaths shallow. "What is that?" she whispered to Thomas, who stood resolute beside her despite the horror before them. "Something old," Thomas murmured. "And something evil." Father Michael raised his trembling voice, his rosary rattling in his grip. "Forgive us," he pleaded, his words faltering. "We meant no harm. We will reseal the tomb." Silence, the shadow bellowed, its form twisting violently. The ground beneath them shuddered, and bits of stone fell from the crypt's arched ceiling. "You, priest, are the reason I was bound. You cannot escape what you've done." The villagers turned to Father Michael, confusion and anger mingling on their faces. Sophie stepped forward, her voice rising above the chaos. "What is it talking about? What did you do?" Tears glistened in the priest's eyes as he finally broke. "It's true," he said, his voice heavy with guilt. "This shadow, this creature, is the remnant of a man named Alaric. He was a warlock, a master of dark magic, who terrorized our ancestors. They trapped him here centuries ago, using a spell that required the blood of innocents." Gasps rippled through the group. Sophie felt a chill race down her spine. "And you knew this? You let us live above this thing?" "I thought it was sealed forever," Father Michael said, his voice cracking. "But the curse required periodic rituals to keep it bound. When I became the priest of this church, I was tasked with continuing them. I thought it was wrong, immoral. So I stopped." The shadow laughed, a deep, mocking sound that echoed ominously. "And now here I am." The villagers' fear turned to fury. "You endangered all of us," Thomas shouted, stepping toward Father Michael with his cane raised. "Because of your neglect, we're all at risk." Before anyone could act further, the shadow surged forward, its tendrils lashing out. Max barked and lunged, snapping at the darkness. The creature recoiled briefly, as if surprised by the dog's courage. "You cannot defeat me," it hissed. "This village is mine." Thomas looked around desperately. "There must be a way to stop it," he said. "Father, what did the rituals involve? Can we redo them?" Father Michael shook his head. "The rituals required an ancient text, one I burned years ago. I thought if the spell was gone, no one could ever use it again, for good or ill." "You fool," Thomas spat. "You've doomed us all." Sophie knelt by Max, stroking his fur as she tried to think. The shadow's tendrils were advancing again, driving the villagers toward the crypt walls. Her gaze fell on the broken slab and the inscriptions beneath it, symbols she didn't recognize, but that seemed to pulse faintly with an inner light. "Wait," she said, her voice urgent. "What about the symbols? Could they be part of the spell?" Father Michael's eyes widened. "They might be," he admitted, "but I don't know how to use them." Thomas stepped forward. "We don't have a choice. If there's even a chance, we have to try." The villagers rallied, their fear giving way to a grim determination. Under Thomas's direction, they began moving stones and clearing debris, revealing more of the ancient symbols. Father Michael hesitated, but Sophie grabbed his arm. "You caused this," she said firmly. "Now help us fix it." As the villagers worked, the shadow grew more aggressive, its tendrils lashing out with increasing speed. One struck close to Sophie, and Max barked furiously, placing himself between her and the creature. "Stay back," Sophie shouted, her voice breaking. "Leave us alone." The shadow laughed again. "Your efforts are futile," it sneered. "You cannot bind me twice." But the symbols beneath the slab began to glow brighter as they were fully uncovered. Father Michael stepped forward, reciting fragments of prayers and chants from memory. Though imperfect, his voice carried the weight of conviction. The shadow recoiled slightly, as if the glowing symbols were causing it pain. "No," it roared. "This cannot be." Sophie felt a surge of hope. "It's working," she cried. "Keep going." Father Michael continued his prayers, while Sophie and Thomas worked to connect the symbols using the chalk found in the crypt. As the final lines were drawn, the chamber trembled violently. The glowing inscriptions flared to life, casting a brilliant light that filled the room. The shadow screamed, its form writhing as it was pulled back toward the tomb. "You cannot hold me forever," it bellowed. "I will return." With a final, deafening roar, the shadow was dragged into the stone slab. The symbols glowed brighter for a moment before fading, leaving the crypt in silence once more. The villagers stood in stunned disbelief. Sophie hugged Max tightly, tears streaming down her face. "You did it, boy," she whispered. "You saved us." Father Michael collapsed to his knees, his face a mixture of relief and anguish. Thomas helped him to his feet, his expression hard. "You owe this village the truth," he said, "and a way forward." The group ascended the stairs, leaving the crypt behind. But as they emerged into the snow-covered churchyard, a lingering unease remained. They had won, but at what cost? The first rays of dawn peeked over the snowy hills of Winter Hollow, painting the village in hues of gold and pink. But no one in the small town felt the peace that Christmas morning should bring. The events in the crypt weighed heavily on everyone who had been there. Exhausted and shaken, the villagers gathered in the churchyard, seeking answers and direction. Father Michael stood before them, his once commanding presence diminished. He clutched his rosary tightly, his voice raw with emotion as he addressed the crowd. "I have failed you," he began, his tone heavy with remorse. "I thought by ignoring the rituals, I was protecting this village from its dark past. Instead, I put all of you in danger." A hush fell over the crowd. Thomas, leaning on his cane, stepped forward. His face, lined with age and wisdom, was stern but not without compassion. "Your intentions may have been good, Father, but you hid the truth from us. Secrets like this fester and grow. If we are to move forward, we must confront them. Together." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the group. Sophie, standing with Max by her side, spoke up, her voice steady despite the fear that lingered in her heart. "What happens now? How do we make sure this never happens again?" Father Michael nodded, drawing strength from the villagers' determination. "The crypt must be sealed permanently, with protection stronger than the ones before. And the story of what happened here, what has always been beneath this church, must be preserved so no one forgets." The villagers set to work immediately, pooling their resources and skills. Under Thomas's direction, masons and craftsmen began reinforcing the crypt's entrance with heavy iron and layers of stone. Sophie, with Max faithfully by her side, helped transcribe the ancient symbols onto new slabs of marble. Each symbol was meticulously painted with sacred oils, their meaning a mystery but their power undeniable. As the sun climbed higher, Edgar Willoughby, still weak but recovering, sat near the church steps, his face contemplative. Sophie brought him a warm cup of tea, her curiosity finally spilling over. "Mr. Willoughby," she began gently, "how did you end up in that casket? Who did this to you?" Edgar's eyes, still shadowed by his ordeal, flicked toward Father Michael. "I was investigating," he admitted. "I'd heard whispers about the crypt, about the rituals. I confronted Father Michael, but someone didn't want me uncovering the truth." Gasps rippled through the group. Father Michael's face drained of color, but before anyone could accuse him, Edgar raised a hand. "It wasn't him," he said firmly. "Someone else, a stranger I didn't recognize. They must have drugged me, thinking burying me alive would silence me." Thomas narrowed his eyes. "A stranger in Winter Hollow? That's a rare occurrence." As the day wore on, a growing unease settled over the villagers. Who had tried to bury Edgar alive? Was it truly an outsider, or someone from within their own ranks? Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow's influence might have extended further than they realized. When the sealing of the crypt was nearly complete, Father Michael called everyone into the church for one final prayer. The congregation filled the pews, their breaths fogging in the chilly air. Candles flickered on the altar, casting shadows that danced across the walls. Father Michael stood before them, his voice steady but tinged with sorrow. "This church has stood as a symbol of faith and community for generations. But faith is not about blind trust. It's about facing the darkness with honesty and courage. I failed you in this, but with God's help and yours, I hope to earn back your trust." The villagers bowed their heads, murmuring their assent. Sophie, her hand resting on Max's head, felt a flicker of hope amid the tension. They had faced the shadow and won, for now. That night, the villagers returned to their homes, seeking solace in the warmth of family and the quiet hum of the season. Sophie, however, couldn't sleep. Max paced restlessly by the door, his ears twitching at every sound. "Do you feel it too?" she whispered, stroking his fur. She glanced out the window, the snow reflecting the moonlight like a silvery blanket. The village seemed calm, yet something gnawed at her, a sense that the danger wasn't entirely gone. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Startled, she opened it to find Thomas standing there, his expression grave. "Sophie," he said, "there's something you need to see." In the quiet stillness of the crypt, a faint glow emanated from the symbols on the sealed tomb. Thomas led Sophie down the steps, Max following close behind. The mason swore it was fully sealed, he said, his voice low. "But look." The glowing symbols pulsed faintly, as if in response to their presence. Sophie's breath caught. "What does it mean?" "I'm not sure," Thomas admitted, "but I know one thing. The Shadow's warning wasn't an idle threat." "This isn't over," Max growled softly, his nose pressed to the ground as if picking up a scent. Sophie knelt beside him, her hand trembling as she touched the cold stone. "Then we need to be ready," she said. "Whatever comes next, we face it together." Thomas nodded, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We will. Winter Hollow has survived this long. We'll survive again." As the church bell rang out the hour of midnight, Sophie and Thomas stood in the crypt, their resolve strong despite the lingering fear. Above them, the snow continued to fall, blanketing Winter Hollow in an uneasy peace. And deep beneath the earth, the faint glow of the symbols persisted, a silent reminder that some battles are never truly won.